Bragg, sorry, having a senior moment.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the appropriation bill. And the 2024 state budget really can be characterised, I think, as a typical Labor budget. We see record spending, we see record debt, and we see record taxes. And I think the question that South Australians really need to ask themselves is, are they better off today than they were 2 years ago? If we put all of the distraction aside, all of the golf and the football and the car race and the sport, if we put all of that to one side, are South Australians better off today under Malinauskas Labor than they were 2 years ago? And I think the answer is a resounding no. In fact, we know that South Australian families on average are about $20,000 worse off today than they were 2 years ago. And what they don't need at this time of incredible cost of living pressure is a budget that delivers record spending, record debt and record taxation, and that's exactly what this latest budget from Malinauskas Labor delivers. Looking at each of those in turn, sir, we see record spending, and we see it across nearly every government agency. No sort of nothing to show for it, sir, just run-of-the-mill cost overblows. We see nearly every government agency overspending, with an $824 million blowout recorded across whole of government. Major blowouts in the Health Department, over $600 million, Education, over $100 million, Human Services, over $100 million, Transport and Infrastructure, $90 million, and Tourism, about $50 million. Just mismanagement and overspending and record spending and cost blowouts. It's irresponsible financial management, sir. We also see record debt in this budget. Over the forward estimates, we see state debt ballooning to over $44 billion. And that, by the way, is despite nearly half the costs of the North-South Corridor project and the Women's and Children's Hospital not yet even being included in the forward estimates. They're off the books at the moment. So presumably debt is going to increase even more during the life of this government. It's a very, very concerning amount of debt, sir. $44 billion over the forward estimate is more debt than this state has ever been in its history. Indeed, debt per person is going to rise by nearly 60% by the end of the forward estimates compared to Labor's first budget. And we know that having huge debt, $44 billion over the forward estimates, is enormously bad for two reasons. One, we've got to pay interest on this debt. Anyone who's got a mortgage or a credit card knows that it costs to service debt. And in fact, the interest repayments alone on the debt being projected in this budget is over $2 billion annually. It's about $6 million a day, sir. To put that in a bit of perspective, sir, it's nearly the entire budget of the Department for Infrastructure and Transport. It's, I think, about 4 or 5 times the budget of the Department for Environment and Water. We could be building 3 Adelaide Ovals every year just with the amount it's costing us to service the debt, the interest. Money for nothing, sir, because we've been run up this giant credit card bill and it's going to have to be repaid. And that's what I fear as well. Everyone knows we've got to have to pay back debt, anyone who's ever borrowed as well, sir. And we see this budget with glossy pamphlets and posters at train stations saying this is a budget for all South Australians. What that really means is it's debt for all South Australians, sir. It is debt for all South Australians because it's us who is being burdened with this $44 billion of debt. It's all South Australians, whether they're families or small businesses, that are going to have to pay it back. I'm enormously concerned about the level of debt forecast in this budget. The opposition is enormously concerned, and a leader of the opposition has challenged the Treasurer today to prepare a debt reduction plan in future budgets. And commentators are concerned as well, sir. We see Paul Starrick in The Advertiser describing the level of debt as eye-watering and comparing it to the state bank crisis that this state saw in recent history. I think at that time we were dealing with debts at around the $3 billion mark. We're now dealing with $44 billion, sir. Matthew Abraham in Daily described it as a government drowning in cash, yet whacking massive amounts on the credit card. And that's exactly what it is. And I think it's going to have a disproportionate impact on young people today, sir, because it's those really of my generation and those that will follow who are going to be left with the bill from this Treasurer's irresponsible budget, racking up $44 billion worth of debt over the forward estimates, left with the bill to have to pay it back, and perhaps, unfortunately, standing a little too close if and when this debt bomb explodes. So very, very concerned about the level of debt in this budget, sir. Thirdly, we see record taxes in this budget. Despite promising no new taxes in this government, despite promising no tax increases in this government, what we've seen just last week when the budget was handed down is the highest taxing government in the history of South Australia. If it feels like you've never been paying more tax, it's because that's the case. You have never been paying more tax than under Malinauskas Labor, sir. There's been tax increases right across the board in how much Malinauskas Labor is taking in. We see it on GST intake, a 31% increase over the last couple of years of the Malinauskas Labor government. We've seen it on car registration, a 16% increase. We've seen it on payroll tax, 33% increase. So businesses are paying 33% more payroll tax than they were 2 years ago under this Labor government. ESL, Emergency Services Levy, is up 17%. Fines have increased dramatically, up 59%. Land tax, sir. Land tax, we're taking in 48% more land tax than 2 years ago. 48% more land tax, and stamp duty up 7%. So, sir, what we see is despite a government that promised us there'd be no new taxes and there'd be no increase in taxes, is the highest taxing government in history. These sorts of moments are opportunities to compare and contrast, sir, and what you've seen from the Liberal opposition over the last few weeks is a very clear indication that we want to lower your taxes. The Liberals will lower your taxes. We have outlined already a series of policies that will do just that, sir. We want to lower your stamp duty for first home buyers, for all first home buyers, to allow young people to be able to keep the dream of home ownership alive. We want to lower payroll tax for all small businesses by lifting the threshold and also applying an exemption for apprentices and trainees. And we want to scrap this GP tax that we've seen about to be introduced that's going to increase the cost of going to the GP anywhere from between $10 to $20, sir, and it will drive people into our hospitals as well, sir. You've seen all of this announced by the Liberal opposition in the past few days and weeks. So on the one hand, you've got the highest taxing Labor government ever, and on the other hand, you've got a Liberal opposition who wants to lower the taxes for South Australians right across the state, with a plan to lower your stamp duty, lower your payroll tax, and scrap this GP tax, sir. While we're on this exercise of compare and contrast, sir, there is a third force emerging in economic thought and leadership in this state, and it's the South Australian Greens who have released some tax policy as well, sir. And we know that the Greens spend a lot of time running around South Australia with all sorts of policy proposals. We know they want to scrap South Australian submarine building and frigates. We know they want to cut funding for school choice. We know they want to cut private health insurance. We know they want to decriminalise hard drugs. But what we've seen recently from the Greens is a bit of tax policy as well from the economic hardheads at the South Australian Greens. And to their credit, they've told us how they're going to pay for some of these wild policy proposals, sir. And in an Instagram post on the 3rd of June 2024, we see the co-leader of the South Australian Greens, the Honourable Robert Sims, outlining, and the title is How We Will Pay for Our Plans. And he sets out some tax policy for the Greens, which involves, you guessed it, a whole heap of brand new taxes or tax increases for South Australians. And I think South Australians ought to consider the Greens' tax policy at the next election. The Greens are not some sort of safe place to park a protest vote. They're not a sort of easy way to virtue signal on certain issues. What they are is a dangerous, extremist left-wing party who want to tax you, and tax you. And we know that because they've told us. They've told us, sir. If we look at their tax policy, released only a couple of weeks ago, the first is they want to impose a 75% developer tax on land value gains from rezoning. Presumably, that's going to force up the cost of all new development in this state. The price of new housing might increase by 75%, which is the last thing we need when we want to boost housing supply. They want to tax residential properties that are vacant for more than 12 months. Any of my constituents, sir, who might have a holiday home, for example, might be very interested in the Greens' holiday home tax that they've announced. And then the kickers, and I quote, they want to increase land tax, end quote, and they also want to, quote, increase payroll tax for big businesses making super profits. So, sir, what do we see in this exercise of compare and contrast? Under Labor, you've never been paying more tax ever. Under the Greens, you'll be paying a lot more tax by their own admission. A Liberal party, sir, a Liberal government, sir, wants to reduce your taxes, and that's exactly what we'll do if we're elected in 2026. So they're my comments on the budget from a macro perspective, a typical Labor budget where we see record spending, we see record debt, and we see record taxes. In what time I have remaining, I did want to make some remarks from a more local perspective on this state budget, and there are two wins for our local community, I think, in the state budget, sir. Two things that I've been advocating for most of the time I've been in the Parliament now. One is around road safety, particularly at school crossings in the eastern suburbs, and we do see a new $80 million allocation for road safety, including something that I've been calling for in this place on previous occasions, which is a 40-kilometre-hour speed zone near schools on main roads. Sir, this is obviously an area of great interest to my local constituents. It was really brought to the forefront by the horrible accident that occurred at Marriotttville High School last year. Following that accident, we've worked together as a community to achieve a lot of improvements at that intersection. But there's more that can be done, and there's more that can be done right across the state, but indeed the eastern suburbs. And I'm pleased that part of this funding is going to go to reducing those speed limits on main roads and also installing new variable speed signage at school crossings as well. I note that the government and the minister has not yet outlined what priority locations there will be. I would urge the minister to go and read my numerous correspondence to various ministers on this topic, where I have some ready-made plans that the government can implement at schools in the eastern suburbs, particularly those schools that are on or near main roads, whether it's Marriotttville High School on Kensington Road, or Seymour College or Loretto College on Portrush Road, or Linden Park Primary quite close to Portrush Road. I urge the minister to consider my local schools as part of this $80 million funding for school crossing improvements. The other thing that I've been advocating for some time now is more enforcement and crackdown on illegal vaping and tobacco shops, and I see in the state budget, sir, a $16 million allocation to counter the growing illegal trade of tobacco and vaping, with additional staff in CBS to investigate this. Again, sir, this is something I've raised with the government a number of times. It's of great concern to my constituents, particularly some new tobacco and vaping shops that have opened in Stonyfell near St Peter's Girls' School, as well as in Marriotteville near Marriotteville High and also Marriotteville Primary. There's concern about their proximity to those schools. There's also concern about whether they're appropriately licensed to be selling vaping and tobacco, and I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave is sought. Bragg had the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And before the break, I was talking about this state budget as being a typical Labor budget where we've seen record spending, record debt and record taxation. I conducted a bit of a compare and contrast of various taxation policy and concluded that under Labor, South Australians have never been paying more tax in the history of our state. Under the Greens, we know that South Australians will pay even more tax with their new developer tax, their new holiday home tax and their commitment to increase land tax and payroll tax. And under the Liberals, we have committed to lower your taxes, sir, and I spoke of 3 policies that we've been talking about over the past few days and weeks, including our commitment to reduce stamp duty for all first home buyers, our commitment to reduce payroll tax for small business by lifting the threshold and exempting apprentices, and our commitment to scrap the GP tax, sir. So the choice is clear. More tax than ever under Labor, even more tax under the Greens and the Liberals who want to reduce your taxes. I was moving on to talk a little bit about some local issues, sir, and celebrating 2 wins in this budget following significant advocacy by me and my community, including the $80 million funding for school road safety. And I've urged the government now to roll that out in my electorate, particularly on schools that are on or close to Kensington Road and Portrush Road, and also the $16 million in the budget to crack down on illegal vaping and tobacco sales. And once again, I urge the government to roll out that package in my local area and to investigate new stores that have opened in Stonyfell and Marriotteville to help alleviate and respond to very significant community concerns. There were 2 main disappointments locally in the budget for me. One, before this budget, I was calling for increased funding for schooling capacity in the eastern suburbs, and unfortunately we don't see that in this state budget. We do see tens of millions of dollars being spent on new school sites, but mainly in the northern suburbs and also in Mount Barker, sir. We've got a real problem in the eastern suburbs, which is that our schools are at capacity. We've got 3 local primary schools in my electorate, all of which, I think other than Burnside Primary now, are subject to capacity management plans. We have 2 high schools, sir, Marriotteville High School and Glenunga International High School. Glenunga is subject to a capacity management plan as well. Indeed, it's projected to be 153 students over capacity this year, and Marriotteville High School also under extreme pressure, projected to be 136 students over capacity this year. It's more than just numbers, sir. It affects people in my community greatly. Local kids deserve to be able to go to local schools. And if I just go back and look at the correspondence I've received or the people I've met with only in the last 6 months or so, the family I met from Linden Park on the 6th of December, desperately seeking to get into Glenunga International High School. On the 4th of April, a different family from Burnside who has been unable to get their children enrolled at any local high school. On the 11th of April, a different family living in Frueville. They'd just moved into Frueville seeking to get their child into either Glenunga or Marryatville. Both were not possible. On the 4th of June, another constituent, sir, from St George's, who I've been dealing with for quite some time, and his daughter is still unable to be enrolled at Glenunga International High School, and as recently as this week, sir, another constituent who I've been dealing with for a little while now, whose children have been on the wait list for a spot at Glenunga since 2022 and is still unable to get into a local high school. It's not good enough. We really need to increase schooling capacity in the eastern suburbs so local children can go to local schools, and I would urge the government to consider either a new school in the eastern suburbs or substantial investment to increase schooling capacity.
The member for Bragg.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased to avail myself of the opportunity to spend a little bit more time this evening talking about the state budget that was handed down a couple of weeks ago, and to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the new tax policy that the Liberal state opposition have announced over the past few days and weeks. And this, of course, is in addition to my remarks this morning, where I characterised the budget that we saw handed down last week as another typical Labor budget, where we see record spending. Indeed, I think we've seen cost overruns and blowouts in nearly every government department. We see record debt, and I spoke a lot about my concern of the $44 billion worth of debt over the forward estimates that, of course, it's future generations, young people today, that are going to be left bearing the cost for. And, of course, record taxes, because while Malinauskas Labor was a government that promised us they wouldn't introduce any new taxes, a government that promised us they wouldn't increase any taxes, the truth of the matter is this is the highest taxing government in South Australian history. And we see tax and revenue intake being increased right across the board in this state budget, sir. Indeed, I think the headline figure is a 27% increase in tax and revenue collection in this state budget compared to 2 years ago under the Malinauskas Labor government. It's in areas such as GST, where we see a 31% increase, car registration a 16% increase, payroll tax 33% increase, ESL a 17% increase, fines are up by 59%, land tax up 48%, and stamp duty up 7%, sir. So if it feels like you're a South Australian who has never been paying more tax than ever before, it's because you are a South Australian, sir, who has never been paying more tax than ever before in the history of this state. And that's the context, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, in which the Liberal opposition has announced a whole range of policies that seek to actually reduce the taxes of hard-working South Australians during a cost of living crisis. We want to put more money back into the pockets of families, back into the pockets of small business operators who are trying to run their business, because they're best placed to spend their own money. And it contrasts starkly with a Labor government who simply wants to increase your taxes and is taxing you more than you've ever seen in the history of the state. We've introduced a range of policies to lower taxes for South Australians, sir, and I mentioned some of them this morning, but I want to go into a little bit more detail on these policy announcements because they're very important. It's important that South Australians know it's the Liberal Party who wants to lower their taxes. The first way we're going to do this, sir, is through reforms to payroll tax. I spoke about payroll tax in my own maiden speech, sir. I spoke about all of the state-based taxes, which I described as inefficient, inequitable, unfair. But payroll tax in particular, which I described at that time as a tax on jobs. And that's exactly what it is, sir. It's a tax on jobs, which is wrong and is counterproductive. So it's why the Liberal Party over the past couple of weeks has announced a policy of increasing the current payroll tax threshold, which currently sits at $1.5 million, to $2.1 million, sir. It's also why we've introduced a policy that would see an exemption in place on payroll tax on wages paid to apprentices and trainees, so we can encourage those new entrants into the workforce. Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, as you would know, the payroll tax threshold was most recently adjusted by the former Liberal government in 2019, which was a very good move indeed, and it basically removed payroll tax from all small businesses in South Australia. But what we've seen since then, of course, is record inflation. South Australian businesses have been subjected to record award wage increases, including the highest wage increase in history of 5.75% in 2023. And what that means, of course, is that there's a whole raft of small businesses in South Australia who are paying payroll tax for the very first time. They've moved above that $1.5 million threshold through taking no action of their own other than inflationary pressures and these wage increases on their salary books. Payroll tax, sir, can influence a decision by a business to employ new staff. Of course, at this time more than ever, we want South Australian businesses to employ South Australians. The incentive structure is all wrong. We're facing a critical skills shortage, and what we actually want to do through our policies is further incentivise employers by abolishing payroll tax for apprentices and trainees. We want to not only cut tax, sir, but of course create jobs. These are measures that a Liberal government would introduce if we're elected in 2026. These are measures that we've been calling on the Labor government to introduce in this state budget. And it's not just us calling for it, Mr. Speaker, it's industry as well. It's indeed the peak business body in South Australia, the South Australian Business Chamber, calling for this sort of payroll tax reform, crying out for help at this time. And I note that if we were to implement our policy, a raise in the current payroll tax threshold to $2.1 million, we would make South Australia the most competitive threshold in all of Australia. So if you really want to back small business, these are the sorts of policies you need to implement. Don't be under any misapprehension that this is some sort of business-friendly Labor government, that we've got a pro-business premier. While those opposite might quite happily go and sort of sit around the boardroom table and say the right things when they need to, what business in South Australia is going to do is judge this government by their actions. And their actions are a budget today, last week, where we see record tax for South Australians. Their actions are small businesses struggling in a cost of doing business crisis and red tape strangling their operations. And their actions are ignoring calls from not only the Liberal opposition, but peak bodies like the Chamber to seriously reform payroll tax in South Australia. If the Labor Party won't do it, the Liberal Party will back small business. We will cut payroll tax for small business if we are elected. We announced two other tax policies, sir, over the past couple of weeks, including reform to stamp duty, sir. In my maiden speech, I described stamp duty as a tax on the efficient transfer of property, and again, that's exactly what it is. And we want to introduce a stamp duty exemption scheme for first home buyers to include a $10,000 discount on stamp duty for established homes up to a value of $750,000. It's because we want to back young people in South Australia to keep the dream of home ownership alive. And frankly, there's whole generations now of South Australians growing up who are under the apprehension that they will never be able to afford to buy their own home. And that's a great shame on where we've got to. It's a great shame on policymakers in this place that has allowed it to get here. So we need to reform stamp duty to enable the dream of home ownership to stay alive for young people in South Australia. Thirdly and finally, today we also announced that we would be scrapping the GP tax grab that's going to be introduced in less than 2 weeks, sir. That's going to see South Australians pay more to go to the doctor. That's not only going to cost South Australians more in the midst of a cost of living crisis, but it's also going to cost our health system because more people will present at hospitals that will add to record ramping under this Labor government.
The member for